There we go. Hey, I don't know if I've told you guys this enough, but I don't know if you knew this before, but I love each and every single one of you guys so much, and I'm so excited and so glad that you're here. Now, with that being said, since I love you guys, I love you enough that I'm gonna share some very personal information with you guys. Is that okay? Yeah, you guys are cool with that? Okay, now in 2015, do you guys remember 2015? That was a while ago, right? But in 2015, I went to Hawaii. Has anyone ever been to Hawaii before? Yeah, few of you, okay. I'm gonna go again pretty soon, I'm excited. But I was in Hawaii, and it wasn't necessarily vacation, but I played basketball and I had a tournament there. And as I was there, I was in high school, and whenever you're that age, you just want to do whatever's cool. Like you just want to fit in, you just want to do whatever's cool. So I had the idea. I thought it would be cool if we snuck into a hotel and then I jumped in the pool. And the thing in Hawaii, I know some of you guys would do that. I hope I'm not giving anyone any ideas. But the thing about Hawaii is that honestly, like there, at least where I was at, there wasn't like a bunch of fences or gates or anything. Like you could pretty much just like walk up and then go into any hotel pool that you wanted. So then one day, me and my team, we were on our way back from the beach and we walked past this hotel. And I was like, oh, this is gonna be so cool. I'm just gonna jump in the pool. So then I decided, I looked around and there was like no one there, no one at all. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this. So then I jumped into the water and I was in there, I was swimming. I thought I was so cool for about 30 seconds. And then I get my head out of the water and I see that there's a security guard standing right there. And I'm like, oh no, this is it. I'm going to prison. I don't know what jail's gonna be like in Hawaii, but I don't know if I'm gonna survive, but I thought my life was over. So then I get out of the water and I'm like, is everything okay? And surprisingly, the security guard, he was very chill. Like he was a very nice guy. He was very kind. He wasn't mad or upset or anything. So I came out of the water and he was like, hey, I'm gonna have to ask you not to go in the water anymore. And I was like, okay, I'm so sorry. I won't do it again. And he was like, yeah, we closed the pool that you were just swimming in. We closed that pool because a few minutes ago, someone pooped in that water. I swam in someone else's poop. It was so gross. I don't know who's clapping for me, but it was so nasty. I definitely showered after that. It was one of the most embarrassing things that happened to me. But the reason why I share that with you guys is because I did something that was not smart because I was unaware of something that was very important. See, if I was aware that someone just went to the bathroom in that water that I was swimming in, then I definitely wouldn't have gone in there. But what I am thinking and what I feel is that there's a lot of us in here who are unaware of something. A lot of us in here, we're unaware of something that is so important, something that's more important than knowing that there's poop in the pool. That we're unaware of something that's much more significant than that. So I want to start this off by reading Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. It says, so God created human beings in his own image. God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Now, I think the thing that we're unaware of is that each and every single person in here, everyone who's in this building, everyone who's watching online, I think the thing that we're unaware of is the fact that we are created in God's image. Like we are actually created in God's image. And I think that if we were to know that, then things would look different in our lives. I think if we were to not just say it, but to actually believe that we're set apart from the rest of creation and made in his image, then I think that the things that we struggle with wouldn't affect us in the same ways that they do today. Like for example, a lot of us struggle with feeling like we belong or feeling accepted. If we were to know that we're created in God's image, then that would look different. A lot of us, we struggle with just wanting to fit in, or we struggle with the way that we look. But the more that we see that God created us the specific way that we are in his image for a purpose, the more that we'll start to see that we have so much value on this earth. And that's why it's so important to talk about this. And you guys remember last week, we talked about what it means to be created in God's image. And if you guys remember, what it means to be created in his image means that every single human being, everyone, is worthy of honor, respect, dignity, and most important, worthy of love. That's what it means to be created in God's image. Now, it's easy for me to say that, but the only problem is that we live in a culture where the way that we look, our appearance, and our identity isn't something that's celebrated. We live in a culture where more times than not, we're quick to overlook or to minimize the differences that we have with people. See, we live in a culture that doesn't understand how amazing it is to be made in God's image. The world that we live in today is actually quick to treat people differently based off of how they look or based off of their race. And there's actually a word for this, and I think that we all know it. The word for this is racism. Now, whenever a lot of us hear that word, our minds quickly will probably go to slavery, or our minds will maybe go to segregation that we learn about in school. And I think that some of us, maybe we would think or we would believe, or maybe even our parents, they told us that racism is just something of the past. It's something that we've moved on from. Obviously, slavery is illegal. Obviously, we don't segregate the way that happened in the past. So racism is just something that's been put behind us. But let me be very clear right now that just because maybe racism hasn't affected you doesn't mean that it doesn't still exist. For example, I've never been to the Eiffel Tower before. I've never been there, and honestly, it would be cool to go, but I'm not planning on going there anytime soon. So if I were to stand here and tell you guys that, yeah, the Eiffel Tower, it doesn't exist. And if I were to say that just because I've never experienced it, then that doesn't mean that it's true. But see, that's the same thing. And I know some of us in here, as hard as this is to say, some of us have been negatively affected by racism. And if that's you, then I'm glad that you're here, and I'm so sorry that that's happened before. But see, racism is still alive, and it's still so relevant in our culture today. Let me share a few statistics with you if you still don't believe me. Did you know that 10% of police stops that happen in New York, 10%, that's a very, very small number, only 10% of those police stops were people who were white. And then on the other hand, 88% of police stops that happen in New York, 88% of them were either black or Hispanic. And the craziest thing is that the majority of that 80%, they were innocent and they did nothing wrong. Did you also know that both black and white people, they use drugs at about the same rate? So about the same number of people who use drugs compared to black and white, it's about the same. Except for black people are 6 times more likely to be arrested for it. And did you guys also know that black people are twice as likely to be unemployed or to not have a job compared to white people? Now, maybe you're sitting here and you're thinking, okay, this is stuff that I've never experienced before. This is stuff that hasn't really happened to me. Like, I've never been pulled over before. I don't even have a job. Like, this is something that just be super far and has nothing to do with us. But see, when I say that racism still exists, it still exists. Let me go ahead and give you a personal example. I remember, and I will never forget this. I remember when I was 9 years old, and I played basketball, and someone on one of my basketball teams, and I was only 9, I remember he said these words to me, and I still remember, and I don't think I'm ever going to forget this. But I remember he said the words that you're only good at basketball because you're black. And I remember those words stuck with me because for the first time in my life, I felt like I needed to apologize for my skin color or for the way that I look. And I remember that's gonna stick with me because I remember when he said it, he meant it, and he was actually bothered by something that was completely out of my control. Racism is still relevant and still affects so many of us. One of my favorite authors, he says that racism, it doesn't go away, but it just adapts. Or racism, it doesn't just go away, but it just changes over time. Now, I want to be clear. This message, the point of this message is not to just convince us that racism is wrong. I think we would all agree that racism is wrong, right? We would all agree? Yeah? You go ahead and nod your heads. So we would all agree that it's wrong. But the purpose of this message is to show us that maybe there are some areas in our lives where we fail to see other people as being made in God's image. Because think about it. The definition of racism is to think that one certain race is better than others. Or another way of saying that, the definition of racism is to fail to see that other people are made in the image of God. And to think about it like this, and this literally blew my mind. It's so simple. The definition of what race, of the word race, culturally speaking, is that it has to do with the melanin in your skin. And I know not everyone might know this, but melanin is pretty much just what makes your skin darker. So the point that I'm trying to make is that human beings have much more in common than we have differences. See, the thing about melanin is that people who come from a place that's closer to the equator, chances are their skin's gonna be darker because the sun affects you differently there compared to someone who maybe live in Europe or somewhere farther from the equator. Of course, their skin is gonna be lighter because the sun doesn't shine as much there. So the point that I'm trying to make is so crazy that every single human being is made in God's image. The only difference is that some people have a little bit more melanin than others. Now, whenever we think about this, it's important to understand that we are all created in the image of God. I'm gonna keep saying it. We're all created in his image. Now, I wanna pray. That was just the intro. I better hurry up. But I wanna pray, and I wanna talk about how you and I should respond. Like, what should we do? Because sometimes racism can feel like it's this huge thing, and we can feel like, I don't know what we could do about it. But we're gonna talk about what the Bible tells us to do. So let's go ahead and pray. Jesus, thank you for this time. God, we need your help. God, I pray that you would help us to see the fact that every single human being is made in your image. Father, I pray that you would be here, Lord. You promised that you would be present where we gather in your name, Jesus. So I thank you that you're here, and I thank you that you're moving. Jesus, we love you, we need you, and we praise you. And everybody said, Amen. Amen. Now, I want to answer this question. How does God feel about racism? How does God feel about racism? And let me be so clear when I say this. God hates racism. I'm gonna say it again if you missed it. God hates racism. And since that's true, what does that mean for us? Now there's a verse, and we're just gonna look at one specific verse, and that's in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. We're gonna look at that one verse, and that's gonna help show us our response, and it's gonna help show us certain ways that you and I could learn to see other people as image bearers of God. So let's go ahead and read in Micah 6, verse 8. It says, mankind, he has told each of you what is good. And what the Lord requires of you is to act justly, that's one, to love faithfulness, and to walk humbly with your God. So those are the three things that Micah tells us to do. Now, who was Micah? He was actually a prophet. And what a prophet was is they had a specific purpose. And that purpose was to warn the people that if they don't change, then God's judgment is coming. But it's also to tell the people that there is hope. That's exactly what Micah did, because he lived in a culture that was very similar to ours, because the world that Micah lived in is they were so unjust. And they were so messed up, they were so sinful that God was actually gonna punish these people because they kept turning their backs on God. And that's the world that Micah lived in, but I think that's very similar to where we're at today. So there are three things that we could learn from this, three things that are very important. So the first one is this. The first thing that we're commanded to do in Micah chapter 6, verse 8 is to act justly. The first thing is to act justly. So Micah's speaking to people who had completely abandoned justice. And I think that's very similar to the culture that we live in today. Think about the fact that the culture that we live in, there's literally people who literally want to build a wall to keep people out. Like the culture that we live in is, it's very common for people who are Hispanic to be discriminated and hated on in the workplace. And anyone who is treated badly in that way is gonna have lower self-esteem, and most of the time, more likely than not, have more problems with their mental health. But that's the world that we live in today. And whenever God tells us to act justly, what that's referring to is this word justice. And maybe you've heard it before. But what does that mean? This means that God is just, therefore he wants his people to be just as well. So what does that mean for us? How can we live this out? Well, we could act justly. What this means is so simple. The way that we act justly is being concerned with those who are weak. Acting justly means to be concerned with the weak. Now, I think this is really why I have a problem whenever people act like, or whenever Christians act like it's a bad thing to talk about or to even say the phrase Black Lives Matter. Uh-oh, did I just say that? Am I allowed to say that here? People really have a problem with that. And see, I'm not trying to be political. This is not, just like I said last week, my purpose, I'm a pastor. I don't care to get into politics, but see, this is not just a political issue. Racism isn't a political issue, but it's a heart issue that we have. See, whenever I say Black Lives Matter, that's not necessarily an organization or a political thing that I'm referring to, but it's simply saying that these people, that African Americans undoubtedly have been treated badly in this nation. So let's focus our attention and our care on them. That's a good thing. And see, think of it like this. Most of your parents right now, they're in the main worship center. They're having a service in there. Now let's use our imaginations for a second. Let's imagine that the main worship center is on fire right now. Oh! Yeah, crazy. So pretend it's on fire and pretend that this building that we're in right here, this is the only building that has a hose that will be able to put out that fire. So let's pretend that everyone who's in there, they come into this building, they're like, hey, we need help. Help us out. Our building's on fire. And what if we were to say, no, we're not going to help you out. We're not going to give you the hose that you need because this building matters. They would be like, well, of course this building matters, but right now this building's in trouble, so they need help. See, that's exactly the same thing how we should view this issue. Guys, God cares about those who are weak, and since he does, we should as well. Matthew chapter 5, verse 3, it says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17 says, learn to do good, seek justice. Seek what? Say it again, seek what? There we go. It says to seek justice, help the oppressed, defend the cause of orphans, and fight for the rights of widows. So how can you and I live this out? What does this mean for us? To seek justice means to increase our awareness. We can't help be a part of the solution if we don't even know that there's a problem in the first place. So a great place for you and I to start is to increase our awareness. Have a conversation with someone who looks differently than you. Have a conversation with someone who was raised in a different way than you were. See, these are all great things that we could do, great ways that we could act justly. Another way to do this is to simply just ask people questions and to be a learner. Another way is to watch documentaries about racism in this country, or another way that I think is so helpful is to diversify your social media, meaning following other people who may look differently than you or may act differently than you do. This is all gonna help us act justly, which will then help us to see other people as being made in the image of God. So that was the first thing. The first thing that we're commanded to do is act justly. Second thing is this, love faithfulness. Another translation says to love kindness or to show mercy. Now, the people that Micah was talking to, they didn't show mercy. They didn't show kindness. They didn't show love or faithfulness to anyone, but they just cared about themselves. See, that's something that I think is very similar to us today, because how many people have we ever been around where you've talked to them and they would just talk about themselves all the time? Raise your hand if you've ever been in a conversation like that. That is the worst thing in the world, wherever people, you won't even be able to talk to them or say a word because they're just talking about themselves the whole time. And I mean, we live in a culture too where we care so much more about our comfort or our convenience than we do about caring for other people. And I know that I could be guilty of this too, of being so busy with school, being busy with our friends, being busy with all the responsibilities that we have, that we don't even take time to notice that there are people in our lives who are hurting and who need help. See, if we want to be people who love faithfulness, then we need to be people who choose kindness. Now, God is kind, and he calls his children to be kind as well. What are some ways that we could do this? Or what does it mean to love faithfulness? The simple definition is to be willing to show kindness to others. How do we love faithfulness? Be willing to show kindness to other people in our lives. God commands his children to do this all throughout the Bible. Let's look at a few verses. Ephesians 4, verse 32 says this, instead, be kind to each other, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, just as God through Christ has forgiven you. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4. Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud. So what are some ways that you and I can show kindness to other people in our lives? Well, one easy way to do that is to simply care more about others' needs than we do about our own needs. Another way that we could do this is to follow Jesus even when it's hard. See, if we want to be people who live this out and trust and obey him, then that means we need to trust that every single one of the commands that God has given us are actually good for us. See, pride pride says that I'm the most important thing in the world. But if we want to walk with humility, if we want to love faithfulness, then that means saying that God's way is better. That's what we talked about last week. And that's how we live that out. So first thing that we're told to do is to act justly. Second thing that we're told to do is love faithfulness. And third and last thing is to walk humbly with God. We're commanded to walk humbly with him. Now, Micah said these words to a people who did not walk humbly with God. See, they chose pride instead. They chose to be prideful instead of walking with God. And I think that's very similar to our culture today, where we'll show up to JHM on Wednesdays, and maybe even on Sundays too. We'll show up and we won't even listen to the messages. We'll show up and our lives will look exactly the same. There won't be any change because in our heads, we're choosing our ways are better than God's ways. Where we'll show up and to school and we won't even listen to our teachers, and we'll be constantly getting in trouble doing things that we know that are wrong instead of choosing God's ways. And like I said, every command that we're given is for our good. And what pride says that life is all about me. But if we want to follow God, if we want to be people who walk humbly with him, then we need to live out what humility says. And humility says, I love God, so I'm going to obey God. The more that we love him, the more that we'll obey him. And the more that we obey him, the more that we'll love him. That's why we talk about it all the time here at JHM. So what does it look like? How can you and I walk humbly with God? Well, one great way that we could do this is to trust him and obey and know that his ways are best for us and following his commands even when they're hard. And we can't follow God's commands if we don't know God's commands. So another part of this is learning more about God on our own time as well. Like we all have our phones and our Bible apps where there's so many resources, so many Bible plans, and a lot of us do them, which is so great. So many ways that we could get to know God better, because the more that we get to know him, the more that we're going to walk with him. Now, God tells us to walk humbly with him. Look what this verse says about people who are humble. I love this. James chapter 4, verse 6. It says, and he gives grace generously. As the scriptures say, God opposes the proud and he gives grace to the... He gives grace to who? To the humble. And Jesus, he's actually the perfect example of what it means to be humble. Look what Philippians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9 say. Talking of Jesus, it says, he humbled himself in obedience to God, and he died a criminal's death on the cross. Therefore, God elevated him to the place of highest honor and gave him the name above all names. So guys, how do you and I walk humbly with God? What does that mean for us? And this is where I want to close. The way that we walk humbly with God is by building bridges. Building bridges, not barriers. And that's our bottom line. Our bottom line today is build bridges, not barriers. Now maybe you're like, okay, what is he talking about? Well, let's focus on something really simple. What's a barrier? See, a barrier is something that stands in between you and experiencing something new. What's a bridge? A bridge is the thing that helps us get from one perspective to experiencing something new. Now, the truth is though, is that every time we decide to make a joke that's racist, that's building a barrier. Even if we think our friends are gonna think we're so funny, even if they're gonna laugh, whenever we make jokes like that, that's hurtful to people. And guess what that's doing? That's building barriers. Every time we judge people, or every time we already have our minds made up about someone before we even get to know them, in that moment, we're building a barrier. Every single time we think that our race or we think that our culture is better than other people, in those moments, what are we doing? We're building barriers. Every time we fail to see other human beings as made in God's image, in those moments, we're building barriers. Whenever we say things that could be hurtful, but we justify it and say, oh, well, they're my friends, so they're gonna understand. In that moment, we're building barriers. And pretty soon, this is what our lives look like, to where we're just stuck on one side and we won't even try to see something from someone else's perspective because we've built up so many barriers. But see, if we wanna be people that Jesus has called us to be, if we wanna be people who see others as being made in the image of God, then that means that we'll build bridges. Now, we build bridges every time we stand up for someone whenever they're being bullied based off of their race or based off of how they look. We build bridges whenever we take time to actually understand people and take time to actually get to see things from others' perspective. We're people who build bridges whenever we take time out of our busy schedules to actually care for the people around us and the people in our lives. We choose to build bridges when we go at lunch and we see someone who's sitting by themselves, someone who's maybe been bullied before, and we decide to go eat lunch with them because they look like they're alone. We build bridges whenever we choose not to judge someone before we get to know them, but we're actually building bridges when we take the time to have a conversation with someone who's different than us, or maybe whose parents are from a different part of the country or the world than we are. We build bridges when we love other people enough that we want to see life and see the world from their perspective. We are people who build bridges whenever we follow exactly what Micah chapter 6, verse 8 says. In those moments, we're building bridges. And pretty soon, we're gonna be living out what Genesis 1 says. We're gonna be living out, and we're gonna be people who see others as being made in the image of God. And pretty soon, this is what our lives are gonna look like. To where we'll be bridge builders instead of people who build barriers. We can clap for that. You guys don't know how much focus that took. I was about to pass out up here trying to build this thing. But at the end of the day, guys, at the end of the day, we are all created in God's image. And whenever we see other people as made in his image as well, then we're living out the purpose that God has given us. Now, I want you guys, everyone, to close your eyes right now. Everyone who's watching this online or in this building, just go ahead and close your eyes. Now, I want you to use your imaginations right now as we close. And I want all of us to imagine living in a world where we're quick to build bridges, where we're quick to understand people, living in a world where we see others as made in the image of God. Imagine living in a world where everyone in this planet, even though they look different, will all be unified in one body. And the thing that will unify us is our love for Jesus. Imagine living in that world. You go ahead and open your eyes. There was this guy, and his name was John. He's one of Jesus' friends. And one day, long after Jesus had already went back to heaven, John was by himself, and he was on this island. And he had this vision, and he wrote a whole book about it. That book's called Revelation. And these are the words that he said. God actually gives John a sneak peek of what it's going to be like in heaven. And I love this. This is one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible. Revelation chapter 7, verses 9 through 10. It says, after this, I saw a vast crowd. Another way of saying that is a great multitude. I saw a vast crowd, too many and too great for me to count, from every nation and tribe and people and language, standing in front of the throne before the Lamb. That's Jesus. And they were clothed in white robes and held palm branches in their hands, and they were shouting with a great roar, salvation comes from our God who sits on the throne and from the Lamb. Guys, this is exactly what heaven's gonna look like. All of us with our different races, and yes, we will still have our same ethnicities when we're in heaven. We'll all be surrounded, and we'll all be surrounding God's throne. So many people that we can't even count, just worshiping God together. That's what it looks like to build bridges. But guys, the reason why I'm talking about this, the reason why I'm excited is because let's not wait for that to happen. Let's not wait till we get to heaven for that to happen, but let's start right now. Let's let JHM be a place where we care more about what we have in common. We care more about our love for Jesus than we care about judging other people. Let's let that start right now in this place today. But it starts with us understanding what Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 says, right where we started. It starts with us understanding that we're made in God's image. And we're not gonna see other people as made in his image unless we first understand that we're made in his image. So right now, I wanna go ahead, I wanna pray before we close. But I wanna pray specifically for everyone in here who wants today to be the day that you decide to love other people. The day that you decide to see other people as image bearers of God. The day that even if maybe you've made mistakes before, even if you've maybe said things that you regret, things that you wish you could take back, things that were so mean to people and so rude, Even if you made those mistakes, and that's okay, because today is gonna be the day that we start brand new, and that we wanna see others as made in the image of God and live out what God has commanded us. So in a second, I want you to go ahead and raise your hand if you want to commit to loving other people the way that Jesus has created us to do. And I want you to go ahead, you can put your hands up right now. If you want today to be the day that you see other people as being made in the image of God, I see hands going up all over. Praise God. Now you go ahead and put your hands down. Now we're gonna pray together that JHM would be known as a place where we love others unconditionally. Let's go ahead and pray. Jesus, we need you so much. God, I thank you for every single student in here today. God, I praise you that we're here for you, Jesus, and every student who's committed to loving others well. Father, I pray that today would be a brand new day, that we would just grow and come to see other people as bearing your image. God, I pray that we would be known by the way that we love other people, that's how people would know, that people, whenever we go to school, whenever we're in our classrooms, would just feel something different about us, God, and I pray that that would be you. God, for every student who's in here, Lord, I pray that you would just show us ways, give us opportunities to love others well. Father, for the student who is having a hard time with their image or with how they look, I pray in the name of Jesus that they would understand that you created them specifically the way that they are for a reason. You created us all for a very specific purpose. And even though sometimes it's hard, God, I pray that we would understand that no matter what, you are with us, God. You didn't need to create us in your image, but you decided to do that because you love us. Father, I pray that we wouldn't just say that we believe that, but I pray that we would actually know that that's true. That when other people say bad things about us, that we would say, yeah, you can say all you want, but I know who I belong to. God, I pray that you would just help us to see this. And as we grow in our love for you, help us to grow in our love for other people. And as we grow in our love for others, help us to grow in love for ourselves. God, you created us in your image, and you did this because you're good, and you did this because you love us. Jesus, we love you and we praise you. And everybody said, amen. Can we just give it up for what God is doing really quick? And before we stand up, everybody go ahead and have a seat. Everybody have a seat. We have a baptism coming up in a second, but you guys stay seated really quick. Now, right now, we have a few baptisms that are happening, which I'm so excited about. So we're all gonna turn our attention there. After the baptisms are done, we could all go ahead and head to life groups. But guys, thank you so much for being here. If you have tithes or offerings, don't forget to give those to your life group leader. But let's all cheer these students on as they decide to get baptized. everybody. All right, everybody. You guys could all go ahead and go to life groups, but we'll see you again next week. Love you guys.